Morning, everyone. So welcome to our CDP Ireland Network. I was going to say Climate Finance Week, but it's now Sustainable Finance Week event. Welcome to all of you in the room. It's great to see such big numbers here this morning. And also to those of us online, we're always a bit slow to release the online option because network, as it suggests, is about network. We're increasingly looking at the relevance of voluntary disclosures like CDP in a world where we're going to have mandatory disclosures and regulations in this space. And I think it's networks like this where it's shared learning, shared even moaning, and as someone described the CDP network as a bit of a self-help group for those who are going through the challenges of ESG disclosure, which is only getting more challenging and more onerous. So the last 2 weeks, I guess, have been full of conferences and exhibitions. I was conscious we were on Monday, for those of you who are at the AIB Summit, Sustainability Summit in Croke Park, or sorry, the RDS. There was a lot of conversation about the why. Edward Norton and Mary Robinson did an amazing job at reminding us of where we are and the challenges and why we do this and how critical it is. Amazing to hear two people coming with such different perspectives, coming from such different backgrounds with such common perspectives about what needs to be done. I was conscious the previous week there was a big ESG summit, which was very much telling us what. There was a lot of what's about what is CSRD, what is it, and again, the level of knowledge and experience in this particular room is now really in the how. So this morning is going to be more about the how. Conscious that as practitioners, that's what our expectation is, that we will be able to actually guide our businesses and our organizations in terms of the how on the ESG reporting. As you all know, CDP has been increasingly incorporating and aligning with other standards. So we have not just the carbon disclosure now, as its name would have suggested, but other elements of the environmental reporting with water and forests. So I'm delighted to be joined today by guest speakers, Katie Heston, who's Director of Nature and Responsible Business at Goodbody Clearstream, Thomas Ball, who's the Director of Nature and Land Use from KPMG, and Conor Quinlan, who's the Senior Manager for EPA Climate Change. They'll each have a few minutes to give us their perspective on the alignment of CDP and particularly nature. So we're pivoting to considering nature, of which climate obviously is a subset. And also to talk about the issue of risk. The EPA are doing some really interesting work on climate risk. So Conor is going to take us through that. So before we get into the presentations, I'm going to ask Deborah Megan, who's the chair of CDP Ireland Network, to offer a few opening remarks. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. And my remarks will now be incredibly short, as he's pretty much said everything that I want to say. So thanks, Brian. Really just a big welcome to everybody who's come along today, and obviously a big thanks particularly to AIB for hosting us, and Goodbody Clearstream as well for helping organise behind this. And I know Grania is floating around the back of the room, who quietly, studiously does all the work in the background to help and bring these events together, and they are really important. And as Brian says, it is a bit of a self-help group here, and the group is really broad. So I was kind of looking at the attendees today. We have people from construction, engineering, food, insurance, finance, banking, you name it. There's a really broad group in the room today. So please, there's lots of coffee at the back. When the session is over, please do stay around and have a chat, because there's so much experience in the room. And I know everybody's at a different part in the journey when it comes to CSRD and to just generally around disclosure and reporting. So please, again, do take the opportunity to do that. I'll always use this as a great opportunity to say that the CDP Ireland Network is free to join. We're always looking for new members. And again, it's really about this network, about sharing experience and learnings in this, what is, these are challenging times. There's a lot of pressure on organizations around reporting. But I think like everything, this is, it's the start of the journey. Hopefully within the next year or two, as experience is gained, as people go through the process, it will become much clearer how we can make this more efficient, because it is, and I absolutely acknowledge, it's taking up an enormous amount of resources and time and energy for organizations now. But hopefully, like everything else, that will improve. And I think it was, as always, before some of these events, I kind of go on, I look of what reports are happening. And when I put in CSRD and news this morning, funnily enough, not a lot came up. There's a lot of other things happening in the world today. And even though we may think it is the center of our universe, CSRD and the reporting, not a lot came up. However, I did note in the Responsible Investor this morning, they were reporting on a survey that was carried out by PwC in Luxembourg. And they were identifying that of the 200 CEOs that they talked to, they felt the CSRD in the reporting has helped to make a material positive financial impact. They've discovered things about their organizations they didn't know before. And they said actually about 47% of them determined that using CSRD, it actually has an impact on their ability to raise finance, to understand their company. So there's real positive impacts around doing this, understanding your business, how you impact on the world and how the world impacts on you. So although it is painful, and I absolutely appreciate it, it is, I think, we are going in the right way, getting our houses in order, understanding what our impacts are. And as Brian has said, if you were listening to Ed Norton or to Mary Robinson, and again, I heard her also on the radio last week, it is so important that we drive change in our organizations, is that we understand what our impacts are. So I really would like to just personally give a big thanks to Thomas, Conor, and to Katie. I'm really looking forward to this because we just had a great old discussion on mapping. I'm a good old nerd when it comes to GIS and mapping and risk assessment. So it was fantastic to chat earlier on with Thomas and Conor on this, because I think it is important we understand what the impacts are, what the risks that are coming down the line, and how all of this affects particularly biodiversity and nature. So I think they've got some really good insights for us today. So without further ado, I'd like to hand back to Brian, and thank you again very much for coming this morning.
Thanks, Deborah. And just to say, Deborah, obviously, as is very evident by that, has been a massive advocate, and it's great to have somebody with her practical experience guiding us as a network. As I said, we're going to take a little trip through CSRD and CDP alignment with Katie initially, and then Tom's going to take us in a little bit more depth into particularly the nature standards, and then Conor's going to give us an update on the work that the EPA is doing on climate risk. I will ask them to try and keep it maybe to 5 or 8 minutes or so, because I think the panel discussion, and please start not jotting down your questions, because we'd like to keep this as interactive as possible. So Katie, over to you. Maybe I'll flick on the slides for you. So yeah.
Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Katie. I'm Director in Nature and Responsible Business at Goodbody Clearstream. So what is nature? When we speak to nature, we're referring to all of the assets, the processes, and the systems that are contained within those 3 realms that you can see on the screen. Those realms are land and soil, freshwater and oceans, and the atmosphere. Society is intrinsically linked to these. We are dependent on them, but we also highly impact them. The term biodiversity refers to the living elements within these. I think it's important to note that atmosphere, as Brian said, the atmosphere and climate is a part of nature. They are ultimately 2 sides of the same coin. We're pretty familiar with reporting in this room at this stage, so I won't run through the frameworks, but I guess the main drivers of these is that top layer there, that global and supranational level policy. UN, other organizations have set common biodiversity, common land use, and that common climate goal, not to mention water use. And it is these goals, these policies that disclosure standards and the measurements and target standards are looking up to and are being driven from. We all need to move in the one direction, and I think of late we have seen a lot of streamlining of the reporting, purely because I think there's a big reporting burden at the moment, so they all are being stemmed and driven towards that one place. As I said, climate and nature are 2 sides of the same coin. there's benefits of treating them in this way and reporting, holistically reporting them. That business process standardization. So I guess implementing once and reporting or measuring the benefits twice. At the moment, there is a big reporting burden. I think it's fair to say there was a significant uplift in CDP responding this year to get that questionnaire complete. Then you layer on CSRD for companies who are in scope. I think we are seeing our sustainability teams and ESG teams focus on reporting at the moment. So there's reporting, there's financial resourcing efficiencies from treating them the same. So if your focus this year is to decarbonize or to implement climate action, can you implement climate mitigation and adaptation actions that positively benefit nature also? The converse of that is if you do it in a silo, if you're just implementing, mitigation and adaptation without thinking about nature, there can be some negative consequences on it. The frameworks, I'm just going to speak to the similarities between them. Hopefully we are all fairly familiar with them, and if not, this deck will be shared. But I guess the ESRS, so the CSRD standards on the left-hand side there, the general disclosures, that ESRS 2 piece, really aligns very well to the integrated modules in the CDP. CDP has gotten responders speaking the same language that the CSRD is now asking its respondents to speak. So that is your dependencies, impacts, risks and opportunities identification, your risks and opportunities disclosure. So understanding what they are and putting a financial lens on them. So CDP responders really benefit from that, from having that done. We're seeing clients who are not CDP responders and who are doing CSRD for the first time, and they're kind of opting into that financial phase in on the CSRD side of things, whereas CDP responders understand how to financially quantify risks and opportunities. Then, of course, it's the governance. How is sustainability being governed in my organization? And business strategy. So CDP is speaking a language that CSRD is now bringing to a broader scope of people. The environmental are fairly similar. I think the granularity of the metrics that the CSRD are asking for is a little bit more granular. And I think the main difference might be there in E5, that resource use. CDP mainly just speaks to plastic. Obviously in CSRD, there's a broader number of resources brought into the fore. So there are some overlaps. If you are responding to both, believe it or not, you're one of the lucky ones. You're already used to speaking the language that the CSRD is now looking for. In the CSRD, the standards are structured in that governance, strategy, impact, risk and opportunity, and metrics. As I said, the integrated modules in CDP have gotten organizations really comfortable with understanding that you need to, sustainability needs to have a governance structure in order to make it work. It needs to be entwined in my business strategy. It's got organizations speaking and thinking about impacts, risks and opportunities. And then the metrics and targets, there's slight nuances, but the items that are in bold there, if you've responded and responded well to CDP, you will have covered for a CSRD response. We are tight for time, so I'm not going to go through the similarities at a granular level. I think a real key take home here is the targets piece. On the climate side, CDP has been asking for a long time. CSRD is also asking for that. Again, the same with water. The granularity of the metrics in CSRD and CDP are slightly different, but if you've responded and responded well to CDP, you are somewhat covered. There's a lot of overlap in that. The action planning piece of CSRD, which is stumping some companies, we're not really seeing the same difficulty or uplift for those who've responded in CDP. So say, for example, with the voluntary sustainability reporting frameworks, I have just done something to a wire. I think I just pulled a wire out with my foot. I'll speak to this while Grania fixes it a little bit, sorry. It's the action planning. So with that voluntary reporting framework, your sustainability reports, you could put out a target. You could not have to technically speak about the action plan underneath that. CSRD drives companies to speak about that, but the CDP has for quite some time been asking companies to speak to climate action plans, also known as a transition plan, that biodiversity action plan. So really getting companies to measure their initiatives and the success of these. So yeah, to measure their initiatives and to be comfortable speaking about them in a way that shows and proves that they have planned and thought out how to get to a target. I'll leave you on this slide. So I was stealing a slide off a colleague, and this is the objectives of the CSRD. And I wanted to edit it to put in the objectives of the CDP, but they're actually very similar, okay? Both of these frameworks are trying to get companies to the same position, assisting in investment, insisting of investors in understanding what a company is doing, streamlining financial and sustainability reporting. CDP always asks for financial implications on that risks and opportunities piece. Of course, to prevent greenwashing. And then the final piece that both of these reporting frameworks are trying to do is to attain and get the world and companies to those global and supranational goals, and of course the EU Green Deal there. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. I'm going to try not to kick whatever was kicked here. Delighted to welcome Thomas. KPMG have been a great supporter of through their Sustainable Futures of the network. My son is in final year in Trinity doing a business degree, and they said they had this guy from KPMG talking about nature. He said he was brilliant. Tom, so welcome. No.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, to be honest, I didn't think many of them were listening, but at least a few of them are. Thank you. I'll try not to repeat too much. I'll counter through these, but just a couple of insights on nature and biodiversity in particular. But we were having a chat earlier around the ESRSs and the CSRD, and as a scientist or anybody who's sort of grappling with these topics, the breakdown of the ESRSs, it's very clear why they have been broken down that way. But when you're talking about the sort of intersectionality between pollution and freshwater and marine and biodiversity, as I say, as somebody who's kind of come through a scientific perspective, it's useful to break it down, but it's also problematic because you're having to, especially when you're going through a double materiality process, you're trying to unpick where those material parts and impacts are on your business or dependency. And you can say, okay, well, actually, biodiversity maybe isn't the most material. Our business will focus on freshwater pollution, but the minute you start digging into freshwater pollution, you start seeing the intersectionality with biodiversity. And equally, you could say, well, let's do biodiversity where our focus is, and we'll leave out freshwater. And then you suddenly go, well, actually, hang on a second, we've got an intersection there. So in some ways, it's very helpful that they've broken it down this way because it provides attention to those topics, and it means that they get, in theory, the light of day they should be given because of the importance of them. But it does prove problematic and challenging when you're having to unpick some of these topics going through double materiality in particular. So it'll be interesting, maybe we'll get into this discussion later, as maybe there are members in the room who have kind of had to go through this process. But I know in particular when you're being faced with a conversation around, okay, well, hang on, do we focus on this element here in freshwater and do we cover it here in biodiversity? In some cases, you need to be able to cover it off in both. In other instances, you're actually talking about it through a different language because maybe pollution, you're talking about it from a public health perspective. It's not necessarily focusing on the species impacts. But then when you come to biodiversity, you need to be able to capture those impacts potentially. So I want to just acknowledge that there is a challenge there, and there's quite a few companies who are having to go through that process. And there is a way to actually unpick it, but it can be quite overwhelming when you're having to actually start doing it in the first instance. Just very quickly, I won't labor on this, but under the ESRS E4, you've got a multitude of different areas. Just a couple of bits. Biodiversity policies. In effect, that should be a sort of a foundational, overarching element to what you're doing as a business, and some of these sort of core statements that you need to develop, and in theory should be relatively straightforward. But I know from working with a few different companies and maybe some of themselves in this room, even just that exercise in itself, just sort of laying down the core sort of fundamentals of what nature and biodiversity means to the business can be challenging, and what you want to publicly commit to if they're going out into the world effectively. So as we were speaking about earlier, some of these topics are challenging just from a very technical perspective, but then when you're actually having to talk about them in the public sphere, sometimes this is the first time a business is actually having to talk about these topics, and that can be challenging to actually kind of unpick it. So just even to acknowledge the difficulties of just pulling together biodiversity policy is thing. But then when you get into things like biodiversity targets, science-based targets for nature, which I'll come on to in a minute, you start to sort of unpick again another layer, a granular layer of it. And the science is very clear as to where we need to get to, but the practical implementation of that within a business is where obviously the challenge comes, and we'll probably dig into this in conversations later. And then transition planning, which I'll come on to in a minute. The transition planning, as some of you who are following me with the development of the CSRD will have seen, that there was up to a point that transition planning for biodiversity was going to be made more mandatory in terms of actually, if it was material to business, you would be expected to do a transition plan. At the last minute, that was changed, and I think that's understandable as to why that happened, but it's just what that now means when companies are developing transition plans. Are they potentially missing out on some of the opportunities or the intersections which they should be covering, which I'm sure we'll come on to. I'll touch on TNFD just very quickly. For those of you who aren't aware, this is the sort of sister initiative or the follow-on initiative from the TCFD, so the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. In many ways, it's been able to short-circuit some of the challenges that TCFD had to go through. I think TCFD took about sort of 7 years to go from gestation through to being sort of more fully adopted and actually being sort of implemented by some businesses. TNFD is still in the voluntary space, but it's been able to sort of cover off a lot of the same areas which TCFD covered in terms of the main sort of pillars underneath it: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. So that a lot of that's a similarity, which is fantastic. So similarity across all these areas. But the LEAP framework, which many of you may have heard of, is actually one of the most useful elements of it. And under CSRD, there's a recommendation that points towards using the LEAP process when it comes to nature and biodiversity and across the other ESRSs. Just very briefly, what is LEAP? So LEAP is locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. And it's a very sort of simple kind of concept to understand in principle, but actually when you start to dig into it, you start to come and unpick some of these challenges, which we'll maybe come on to in discussion, but effectively locating your interface with nature and biodiversity in the world. And what does that mean for your business? And in many instances, businesses don't necessarily understand those connections to nature and biodiversity. I've having an increasing number of conversations where companies are talking about finding nature and biodiversity not material to their business. And in some instances, you can have a very clear rationale and narrative as to why that's the case. But in other instances, as a sort of a scientist, you can find it quite problematic when you're hearing agri-food companies or other companies that are relying on natural resources, deeming nature and biodiversity not material to their business. I'm aware that you can't have every single aspect material to your business. It becomes so unwieldy that you wouldn't be able to deal with the sort of the workload that may fall out of that. But it is problematic when you can see, and anecdotally, I think maybe others in this room will have heard this as well, nature and biodiversity not being deemed as a material when they rely on natural resources, be it cotton or raw commodities or timber products or fresh water, etc. And that is challenging. So there is this, and it's understandable maybe because it's just become so unwieldy, or it's just not necessarily fully understanding the system. But the locate process as part of TNFD, if a company goes down this process, will usually uncover quite a lot of aspects of a business or a business model or its value chain, and understanding and starting to see these linkages across where they're sourcing products and commodities from, and they start to understand the intersectionality of these topics. So, just anecdotally, one of the things that happens through this process is businesses are looking at their assets across a country, like in Ireland or across the world, and they're discovering parts of their business which they didn't even know necessarily existed, or that they have a part ownership in a manufacturing plant in South America, or they have a building that's in wherever, even just a part of Ireland. In that process, they suddenly start to uncover parts of the business they didn't really fully comprehend. And of course, what's the materiality of that part of it? Some assets or sites may be relatively benign, and actually their impact on nature and biodiversity is potentially very minimal. But in other instances, they suddenly discover that it's got a connection to a marine protected area, or it's near to a special site of special scientific significance, or etc. And you've got to actually unpick that then, and that's really challenging. And some of you may have come across this challenge of the definition of the word near, because there's an element of it which is, are you near an area, a protected habitat, etc. And we've done some work on this. I know many others have tried to break down what the word near means, which actually seems a bit sort of farcical, but actually that's how it's defined at the moment. And the word near can be different depending on where you are and what your asset is, and whether you've got potentially a connection through to freshwater or groundwater systems. The word near can be quite different from if it's air pollution or if it's just direct activities through infrastructure development, etc. So that even is proving challenges in terms of actually understanding that. I'll shut up now in a second, but science-based targets for nature is interesting because it aligns with, thankfully, a lot of the people who are working behind in the background of developing science-based targets for nature also work for CDP, work for WWF, work for a variety of different NGOs who have been developing this. And I think it's fair to say if you were to design the kind of global architecture of these reporting frameworks, you wouldn't end up where we have, which is you've got a whole range and suite of different reporting frameworks which are intersecting. But thankfully, there's a condensing now of these different topics. But just to say, science-based targets framework, the step process through that is step 1 and 2 is very similar to LEAP, and you can actually start to see that alignment. So you can actually take actions through these frameworks where you're covering off TNFD, you're covering off elements of SBTN. And in this slide, you can see you're starting to cover off elements of CSRD, ESRS-E4, and also the EU taxonomy. So there are different languages, different nomenclatures, different breakdowns, but there's an increasing alignment, which is helpful. And hopefully we'll start to unpick it. And I think there will have to be a sort of consolidation. And very quickly, transition planning, which was mentioned before, I think is a really interesting area. This was a big topic yesterday in the central bank that was in financial services perspective, but it's rapidly catching up in terms of the language around integrated transition planning. So integrating nature and biodiversity into your net zero transition plans. Much easier said than done, but I think it's a really interesting area which we might unpick later on.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, very, very interesting commentary in terms of the critical importance of nature. And I did note that particularly the issue of risk came up in a number of places. Those of you who are at the ESG Summit will have heard one of our former colleagues and board members, John Barcroft, talk about changing the word risk to threat. Which I thought actually was an interesting proposition and possibly a better way of looking at it, because risk has the other opportunity. Some of these are real threats, and I think we're going to touch on some of those now. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Conor Quinlan. Conor is on our steering committee, so great to have him here. Conor was saying when he presented the work the EPA were doing to us, he wasn't sure how directly relatable to our members' work would be. And we were all going, no, this is right where we're at now. We are all trying to figure out how we consider climate risk in our businesses. So, Conor, over to you.
Thanks very much, Brian, and thanks for the invitation to come here today and share this work. Just a bit of background on why we're involved in this. The EPA's role, or one of its primary roles, is to provide evidence to inform policy, evidence to support assessments, to support regulation, and indeed to regulate. And part of that, I suppose, is to provide evidence for a wider audience, and such as CSRD and the challenges that the corporate sector faces. So I'm going to talk today about our work in a national climate change risk assessment, which is a really large project that we have underway at the moment, led by the EPA, support from national stakeholders, and the technical work is being led by Dr. Barry Dwyer and Dr. James Fitton from KPMG. I suppose, just to touch on, highlight, just so we're quite clear about the language we're using and the context we're in. Our climate has already changed. The most recent long-term averages from Met Éireann, from an environmental scientist's perspective, are quite stark. We now have an extra month's rainfall in Ireland every year compared to the 1970s. And our temperature is going up in line with global increases in temperature. So what does that mean? It means that type of milder, damp, constantly wet year that we've had is bang in line with projections, and that's quite depressing and quite unnerving, but that looks like we're going. And we've measured that already. That is here now. We are already living in a changed climate. This extra rainfall is not falling as soft, benign rain. It's falling in more extreme events. So I suppose when we look at averages, you look at global warming, average increases in temperature. That's not how it plays out in the ground. You get extreme events, you get dry periods and hot periods, and you get mild, wetter periods. So it's analogous to a person that has, say, an average temperature of 38 degrees. If you put their feet in a freezer and their head in a fire, their average temperature is still 38 degrees. They're just decidedly less comfortable. So that's where we're going, and you need to increase your resilience. So when we look at the evidence on the future impacts of climate change, the scientific evidence, the EPA published Ireland's climate change assessment earlier this year, which was a hugely significant piece of work. We're the only country that has ever tried to replicate the IPCC's AOR process for the synthesis of climate evidence. And when we look at volume 3 of that in particular, what we're going to have to adapt to, you can see that the impacts of climate change go across all sectors of the society and economy, from our environment to our food production, agri-food sectors, our coast in particular with sea level rise, business, water users, etc., the built environment, critical infrastructure, governance, health and well-being. And not only are these sectors going to be impacted, but you'll have cascading risks and a cascade through those sectors, and trying to gain an understanding of that is very, very difficult, and you'll have compound risks as well. So what we're trying to do here for the first time in the national risk assessment is take a single holistic snapshot, I suppose, as a scenario analysis of where those risks are likely to play out, the relative magnitude of risks across sectors, and where we need to direct investment and government action to provide resilience. And just to clarify the terminology we're using here, the future impacts of climate change, be they whatever they are, they're the problem that we face. The risk assessment is designed to identify those and quantify them as best we can. The management process for that is adaptation. I've seen adaptation referred to variously as a risk in itself or as an outcome. It's just the management process. The outcome is climate resilience. And what does resilience mean? In simple terms, it means that systems, be they natural or human, can go on functioning as they would have in the absence of climate change. And we have a national objective to be resilient by 2050. What does it mean technically? And you can see countries now moving into a very technical space there. France are about, I think, to declare that resilience for them means that they have to be resilient to the impacts of a global increase of temperatures of 3 degrees by the end of the century. That's a 4-degree France. Licensing from the Environment Agency in the UK often specifies that businesses have to have an adaptation plan that shows that they're resilient to a 2-degree rise in temperature by 2050. So you can see technical metrics underpinning resilience coming into play now. Just a quick overview of the National Climate Change Risk Assessment. It's a semi-quantitative risk assessment for Ireland. So we're looking at the whole country in standard climate scenarios, standard time horizons. So we're looking at Ireland at 2030, 2050, 2100 under RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5. So for those of you not familiar with those, RCP 8.5 is a kind of a worst case scenario. We're told now by the IPCC that we're very unlikely to follow that path, but it's included as best practice as a worst case scenario. RCP 4.5 is kind of the path we're on in terms of our emissions. It's not a net zero path for the world or for Ireland, but it's the pathway that we're on currently. So our mitigation efforts should rightly be focused on net zero by 2050, especially as a small, wealthy country. If we can't do it, who else can? But we do have to adapt to the sum total of global emissions, be they whatever they will be. And right now, RCP 4.5 is probably even overly optimistic, actually, in fact. But we're moving away from including the very optimistic scenarios because at this point in time, they're just unrealistic. We will be risk takers from the global total greenhouse gas concentrations. So I think it's prudent that we risk assess on that basis. We're bringing in data where we can. That's why it's semi-quantitative, but there's a lot of data gaps. So there's a bit of expert judgment in there as well. And that's why it's semi-quantitative. The goal of this is to produce a prioritized national risk register for Ireland across all sectors that prioritizes adaptation-related investments and assesses the robustness of policy in that area. It provides a consistent evidence base for adaptation across all sectors, and it will be an enduring structure for periodic update to inform the climate action plan and how we frame adaptation in Ireland. It's iterative. We're going to develop it. The UK, for example, is on their 4th climate change risk assessment now. This is our first. We're learning from the UK and New Zealand. I think talking to the Barry and James about this last week, we've been able to leap ahead of them by, starting later as a smaller country, looking at what they've done. We've now actually advanced on what the UK and New Zealand have done. This is far more granular. It's far more detailed. There's a lot more quantitative elements in it and spatial elements in it. So it really will be a robust guide for the commercial sector. I think the scenarios that are included, the data sets that are included, and that prioritization piece should inform a lot of your own thinking about adaptation. And just when we talk about risk or threat, we just need to make clear as well that we're using the IPCC risk framework, which for me, having worked in consultancy on risk assessments for a long time, is quite different, because you're not just using an asset or an environmental receptor. There's a vulnerability piece in there as well, which is a kind of a new third leg to the stool, and that's socioeconomic vulnerability. So when we do flood risk assessment for adaptation, for example, it's not just about the value of property that's flooded. It's also about the vulnerability of the inhabitants of the houses. How old or poor are they, or whatever is the case may be, in terms of their ability to be resilient, to bounce back, or to water shortage events, etc. So we have to take vulnerability into account. And just from a technical perspective, it's difficult enough to define, classify, and measure vulnerability in the present day. When you start to do that out to 2050, it gets increasingly more complex. So there's a 3-stage approach to the risk assessment. Stage 1 is risk identification, where we've taken All of the evidence from Ireland's climate change assessment and international literature and stakeholders who've been involved in adaptation planning or adaptation sectors in Ireland to date. And the team completed a long list of risks. We then bring in the spatial data where we have it. So just to quickly explain that, we're bringing in what are now standardized national climate change projections. So Met Éireann produced a set of standardized national climate change projections called the Translate set of projections. They're really high quality, really granular for Ireland, for individual scenarios. Now, we can't say with any certainty what scenario we'll land on, but when we select scenarios for scenario assessment, these are a really high quality data set to base that on. From those then we index to, or we base secondary climatic variables on. So we'd have water resources that the EPA are responsible for developing, flooding, OPW, groundwater, GSI, sea level rise, Marine Institute, etc. We then take population projections on top of that, which is outside of the climate services space, but again, another layer of uncertainty. As you know, we have, in comparison to other countries, we have quite a strongly growing population. It's also aging. And we take all of those spatial data sets and non-climate data sets into account in stage 2 to kind of come up with a semi-quantitative gross risk estimate for the country. And what's really interesting when we look at that is because of our growing aging population, for some risks up to the 2050 period, there are other factors other than climate change that are the main driver of risk, like the aging and growing population for some health-related risks, as opposed to the increases in climate exposure due to a hazard of heat wave, for example. It seems that as you move towards the second half of the century and the impacts of climate change become more pronounced, that flips and climate becomes the main driver of risk as opposed to the non-climatic factors. But stage 2 leaves us with an estimate of gross risk for the country. To get the output of stage 3, then we take account of, or we try to take account of, existing adaptation plans across all sectors and how what level of efficacy they have, existing or proposed adaptation. We then look at the urgency that's required to adapt over the next 5 years, and that informs the prioritization of our table. So just a quick illustration. I won't go into this in detail. This is our estimate of consequence when we're in that stage 2 and stage 3 phase. And you can see we've got 4 levels of impact: catastrophic, critical, substantial, limited. These are on a national basis. We're reporting on a NUTS 3 basis, so on a regional basis in those 8 areas. And it's aggregated data, and this will inform sectoral risk assessments that will be done to a finer level of detail in sectoral adaptation plans. So we're looking at economic damage, and I should point out here, or impact on people, or other impacts. So if you look there at a critical, for something to be deemed critical, for example, it has to be up to 1% of GNI star. It has to impact in terms of greater than 10 to 100 deaths, greater than 100 to 1,000 health impacts, etc. Or there's the land-based or the species-based metrics on the right-hand side. So there's a degree of there's several options in there for how we assess consequence. We then get to the decision urgency piece, which is around whether or not we need more action now, whether we need further investigation to sustain the current action if we have adaptation plans in place, or whether or not we take a watching brief. So sustain current action in some areas where we have robust adaptation plans in place, or we have plans in place that have work underway to achieve that. Maybe water resources, maybe flooding are good examples of that. Watching brief, you're looking at things that we have a lot of uncertainty about, potentially some high impact, low probability events like the AMOC, or as we call it, the Gulf Stream here. We don't have enough evidence to suggest what we're looking at in terms of tipping points then, so you're into a watching brief space. But I think from the private sector's perspective, we're very keen to engage with people in the provision of evidence. This is a really joined up effort to provide evidence to the adaptation sectors and to the government. We're keen as well, while we're developing these data sets and developing this evidence set, that we take the perspectives of all stakeholders into account. We have set up a adaptation practitioner network called the KEAN. You can join it by emailing climate.ireland@epa.ie. And this year we're setting up 4 working groups to inform adaptation planning that will follow on from risk assessment stages in this process. So just I'll quickly mention, we have 4 working groups. One is perspectives on the technical aspects of a resilience definition. So, should we be resilient to 2 degrees by 2050, to an RCP by a certain date, etc., as other countries have gone down? What are the barriers, the opportunities that people see there? The second one is approaches to decision making under uncertainty. So we know that the climate services we have are as good as we can ever have now. Essentially, there'll always be uncertainty. So how do we make decisions in that space? The third is the incorporation of just resilience into adaptation planning. And the fifth is how do we measure our progress here? How do we measure indicators? And the methodology for our risk assessment is available online now by that QR code or on climateireland.ie. And the finished risk assessment should be out shortly after Q1 next year. Thanks very much.
That was both refreshing that this issue is being looked at in such detail, but also somewhat frightening. Get them on. Yep. Okay, very good. Katie, I might just start with yourself. I think a lot of people are struggling with the idea of multiplicity of disclosures and data and stuff like that. But I think you tied in the links between CDP and CSRD very well. What are the benefits in taking that approach in terms of looking at the standards together?
I think
No.
this one, there we go. Yeah, there definitely is. Like, as I said, we want to get to a place where we're implementing once and potentially getting two benefits or reporting in a similar way in two different places. I think CDP is really good for investors. And until the CSRD gets to that more machine readable place where analysts and investors can accurately look at how a company's doing, I think there's a strong benefit in having a CDP response and getting that score and getting that external validation piece.
Yeah, we've 27,000 companies across the world or so disclosing to CDP.
Yeah.
The other thing that we forget sometimes here, I think in Ireland, is that we're going to have ISSB, we're going to have a different UK standard. So I think for larger companies, they're going to be dealing with multiplicity of disclosures anyway.
Like, we are seeing that. Scolded is too strong of a word, but recently I was given out to as being a sustainability consultant and advocating for the fact that in the CSRD you can comply and justify. But I honestly am seeing with companies that we're working with, their ESG teams are having to pivot to reporting and minimize or pause on that implementation piece. And we know that that isn't enough. We know that we do need to implement. Reporting should come second, but right now it is what's driving it. And I think reporting frameworks need to streamline. They are, but I think a closer amalgamation will ensure that we can focus and pivot to implementation again.
Okay, thanks, Katie. Thomas, the whole issue of nature for businesses has been, I suppose if we go back 3, 4, 5 years, it wasn't much discussed. It's often been described as the silent stakeholder. In fact, there's a great video, Apple little video, where Mother Nature comes to visit Cupertino. She's given Apple a hard time. So if you haven't seen it, look it up on YouTube. But so what's driving the focus on nature? And I suppose why is it so important for businesses to consider their nature impacts?
I won't give the whole history of it because it's been a long time in the making. I think for anybody who's been working these topics, it's been clear for some time that nature has played sort of second order priority when it comes to companies looking at sort of their impacts on the world. But casting your mind back sort of into the 70s and 80s, there was huge amounts of work looking at sort of the impacts we were having on the world and at the time, and looking at how we could understand our sort of business model and our economy's relationship and dependency on the natural world. But in terms of actually sort of business action, it really is, as you say, come to the fore in the last few years because of the regulation and the work of various NGOs around the world, and sort of just really shining a light on the dependency of nature. There's a stat that's overused, which kind of annoys me when it keeps being used, but the sort of saying that half of the global GDP relies or is heavily dependent on nature and biodiversity and its services. At COP16 in Cali, where I just was, the general narrative was there's pretty much no part of the economy which isn't reliant on the natural world in some shape or form. So actually it's kind of problematic to say it's only half of the world's GDP when actually it's pretty much everything in some shape or form. There's so much interconnectedness. But anyway, what does that mean for now? There is a greater understanding of the interlinkages of climate change and nature and biodiversity, which is fantastic. Even on your slide earlier, and I know the NGFS and others are putting climate as a subset to nature, which I know is probably confusing people even a little bit more. But effectively, understanding what that interface with nature and biodiversity is for your business is challenging, but it's so critical when it comes to actually making decisions going forward. So you're not missing out on opportunities. You're not making decisions which deliver trade-offs. You're having a sort of a carbon lens, which you're missing out on opportunities which you can work with your business. And just to say, I find it fascinating. Maybe others would agree, is that we can see nature and biodiversity. And every time you talk to a business leader or anybody in your daily life, I've never met anybody who kind of says they don't like nature. That one of the things that they talk about through COVID was their sort of reconnection with the natural world and getting out into the natural world. And so on a sort of very intrinsic level, most people have an understanding or an appreciation for the natural world. But actually, when it comes into what that means in business, there seems to be a challenge of bringing that into the world, into what that means for businesses. And just very quickly, I use this anecdote quite a lot. My mother-in-law and I, she knows what I do for for my day job, but we argue almost weekly on the level of the grass in the back garden, sort of talking about sort of wildflower meadows and hedgerows and all the rest. And I only share that because there's some very fundamental core sort of like basics which we've become so disconnected from the natural world that even just these very sort of simple conversations need to still be had. So we've got this big macro level which we need to understand our interface with nature and biodiversity, but on a very human basic level, we're still trying to understand what our connection is with the natural world.
That's it. The mother-in-law and nature arguments. I'm glad to be in your house. It is interesting, and I think when you mentioned, and even some of the terminology that's used, we hear a lot about the confusing ESG and sustainability, and there's this pushback that we're seeing around the topic ESG. But when you start to talk about it in real terms, like nature, and in fact, a lot of our US clients have a very strong appreciation for nature. You can't mention climate because that's someone else's problem, but actually nature, maybe it's because it's my land, my home, nature. One of the big challenges that a lot of our clients seem to have is how to measure it, and very often it's starting. When we had climate, we could start off doing a little bit of scope 1 and 2, and then maybe take in a few more sites. We do our head office, and so there was a bit of a pathway. But the measurement of nature, it seemed to have been landed on top of us, and we have to take a much more holistic view. And there isn't really doesn't seem to be a sort of an easy pathway into it, or is there? Is there a way you recommend companies to get on the journey? As I said, as we did with carbon, maybe in scope 1 and 2, and then into scope 3.
Yeah, it's a big topic, but very briefly, I mentioned LEAP earlier. I mean, the LEAP framework is not necessarily groundbreaking in its thinking, but it's a very simple process to actually understand it. So you're right, there are some real challenges around sort of the tools and the data and the how you link these different topics. But one of the fundamentals is actually just understanding at a very basic level where do you interface with the natural world in a very real term. So the sort of literally understanding where your assets are across the world. What does that mean? What type of business you run? So if you have only a few sites in urban areas dotted around the country or in different parts of the world, you can quickly understand what that means. And just literally understanding, okay, where are we located? What was the natural environment? Have we had to convert natural land to build a site, et cetera, to other companies like infrastructure who have a very fundamental, actually their entire business model has some impact on nature and biodiversity in some shape or form. But understanding it without necessarily getting into deep science or deep ecology, you just literally just mapping where your assets are across the world, or in Ireland, for instance, is very important. But just quickly on data and metrics, it depends on which talk you go into. It's too much data, it's too little data, what do you do with it? I think it's fair to say there is vast quantities of data. You can probably talk to this a little bit in much more detail than I can, but where I've found one of the challenges is connecting the data points between different things depending on the business. So a very small example, this came up yesterday in the Sustainable Insurance Forum, is that you can take a bunch of scientific data and you can understand it. Then when you want to relate it through to real world impacts or to ecosystem services, some of the tools that exist for like Encore, which some of you may be aware of, you can use are very useful. but they're not very useful for other parts of the economy. And that's where there's some real challenges. So there's a huge amount of work going on, but I suspect it'll be cracked in the next 12 to 24 months. But that's where some of the challenges are, linking that data so you can actually then make decisions off the back of it, because at the moment sometimes you just can't.
If I can.
Yeah,
I'm not sure what this one. There we go. Don't be afraid to start small either. Like, there are challenges with data, and I think the value chain mapping and the looking at your whole business model is really daunting. There might not be data for your whole business model, so don't be afraid to just look at your own operations and feel comfortable doing that, or picking a specific commodity or an item in nature that biodiversity provides to you, and starting with the leap approach there. I think if you can't get nature for your full value chain, don't be afraid to start small on that one.
So we've moved on from beehives and insect hotels, anyway. Good. Conor, I was just reading something this morning before I came over that in the UK, that I think it's a business at the Confederation of UK Business has done an estimate that the cost to industry from flooding alone is in excess of 1 billion euros. Now, they measured it in pounds, obviously, over a 3-year period. So for businesses, this is a very real threat. And I suppose probably you're providing some information and data that's going to be very important to businesses. So I guess, how should businesses engage with what you're doing and think about the work that you're doing at the EPA?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So I suppose our role that we've thought about this over the course of many years. We collect a lot of data, and it's to turn that data into information that's actionable and makes sense to people who are not, in the scientific community. So in the climate space for this, and firstly, why should they engage? For the simple fact, I think you can summarize it, that you can't negotiate with physics. So we're going to have to face what we're going to have to face, and that's the end of it. And we have very good, robust evidence to show that we are facing these challenges. In terms of the climate data or information, the term that we're using for that is climate services. So the kind of actionable, usable information is climate services. We now have a national framework for climate services that's led by Med Éireann, and the constituent organisations, EPA, OPW, Marine Institute, etc., are now focused on providing actionable, usable information, that climate services that users need, and that includes the corporate sector. So I'd invite people to engage with ourselves via the Climate Ireland email address, or Med Éireann, the NFCS, to, we can only produce the information and the services if we know what's required. And I suppose that's why I'm here today. Our remit is to, support, through the provision of evidence, support climate action across all sectors. So if we know what the corporate sector needs, we can produce those services. They may already exist, or they could be slightly tweaked and repurposed, but we need that interaction to do that.
Yeah, you used a word earlier, resilience, which I thought was really interesting in the context of your output is an expected resilience. And I think it's a word that more businesses maybe need to start thinking and using. Like, we have this threat, opportunity, risk, opportunity, impact. But I think resilience ultimately is what we're trying to achieve in that. I suppose that's another word for sustainability, maybe. So in terms of how you see this develop, because this is over a period of 5 years, 10 years, and I think you talked about future generations. It's happening right now, obviously. We're seeing it in Spain, we're seeing it here at home and Middleton and other places. When businesses are thinking about aligning with what you're doing, will there be a constant, is this going to be something that's going to be on an ongoing basis, a source of data that we'll be able to go through and say, this is how the Irish government views? And also, how are you working maybe with some of the international organizations, back to Thomas's point about what's near and what's from a European perspective, maybe?
Yeah, so like with this, our work feeds into the wider, I suppose, government response to adaptation, which is outlined in the National Adaptation Framework under the Climate Action Plan. That sectors, there's now 14 adaptation sectors, they'll have adaptation plans every 5 years, I think a maximum of every 5 years. This is part of the evidence base that underpins that. And I suppose the commercial sector, in your relevant sector, adaptation sector, you'd have input there into those adaptation plans, guidance that comes out of them, be it communications, transport, health, whatever. So that's the avenue, I think, for business in terms of adaptation planning. In terms of international groups, our national risk assessment, we very consciously designed it to be nested within what's called the European Climate Risk Assessment. So that was published by the European Environment Agency earlier this year. And we've taken the same systems-led approach. So we're looking to try and get at those cross-cutting issues and track cascading risks across sectors. It's complicated. It's the first iteration of it. It will improve over time. But we're also engaged with the INET groups in the European Environment Agency to look at then, okay, how do you take the outputs of these risk assessments and actually take adaptation decisions? Because you talked about risks and threats. I suppose to borrow a phrase that I heard someone in the insurance sector recently said, if something is definitely going to happen, it's not a risk, it's a foregone conclusion. And we need to, I think, socialize the language of this in a more accessible way. When we talk about certain risks in relation to climate change, whether or not we'll get increased tick-borne diseases here, it's probable, we don't know when it'll happen. Mosquitoes at best or at worst latter part of this century, it's not going to happen overnight. We can be far more certain about other things. Sea level rise, we absolutely know it's happened. Like since the 1800s, sea level around Ireland on average has risen by about the height of this stage here. And by the end of the century, that's more than, you know, you're heading for nearly double that. Now, the question is how bad does it get? That's the best case scenario. So that is a threat in a sense. We know that's going to happen. So I think we can be far clearer about where our levels of confidence lie in that. And that should give people, I think, more agency to act.
Thanks very much, Conor. Questions from the audience? I think the area is probably small enough so you'll be able to get up and shout. Any questions? Yes, Mark.
With regard to the term nature, I think a lot of people just focus on biodiversity. I'd just like if Thomas would explain nature a little bit more clearly, because it encompasses a wide range of aspects that aren't just the grass growing back our garden. And I think people need to understand that nature is not that simple a phrase at all. It's quite a complex area that needs, I think, much more investigation.
Yeah, you're right, and it is interesting. I generally lead with the term nature because it's more encompassing. So it encompasses the living world and all the systems around it. So it's the system, it's the air, it's the water, it's the geology, it's the mountains around us. And the CBD have quite a nice sort of definition of it to make it quite simple. Biodiversity is the diversity within living organisms and the species within it. So you're talking about all the living organisms on the planet, the plants, the animals, the insects, and the diversity within it. So you're right, it does confuse people, and you know, sometimes you use the word nature and it has a particular reaction. For some people, it feels a bit sort of ephemeral or not necessarily tangible. Biodiversity, in the other sense, can feel quite niche because they're like, well, why should I care about a particular species or an insect or whatever it is? So in some ways, both terms have their own challenges. But nature is the more encompassing term, which actually encompasses all the systems effectively that are part of, you know, climate and all of the things that we have to deal with and what you were describing. So yes, I agree. How you unpick that, I guess it's part of education. You know, here we're all talking, we're sharing knowledge, all the rest, but you know, just on nature and biodiversity in particular, it's self-identified even through financial services here in Ireland. It was one of the areas that they felt they had the least knowledge on. So there's just a general education piece that needs to go in. Like, for instance, I'm having to educate myself on parts of the financial services sector, which I didn't have to know because I need to unpick that to understand the language. So I think there's just a huge amount of knowledge sharing. I need to know more about parts of the financial services sector so I can speak from a scientific perspective. Equally, people who are in business leadership positions in financial services need to learn more about my world to some degree, and how do we interface within each other without having to all go back to college and do another degree.
Thank you. Other questions? Deborah.
Yeah, sorry, the last member again is up for asking a question of Conor. I suppose a lot of the corporates in a separate role I had a few years ago, we were looking at forestry, and I remember the time over in the south of England, there was a pushback against forestry England because they were planting French oaks in the south of England. And the reason for that was they said, well, the temperature is rising, the English oaks won't survive, and if we're to actually preserve the oak forest, we need to look at the species of oaks that we're planting there. So they were looking at changing that. You're mapping systems that you're doing here in Ireland. How can that help corporates make decisions? As I said, that adaptation piece, whether it's when you're building new housing estate, what's the size of the culverts that you need to put in? What's the risk in various different parts? How accessible will that data be to corporates to help them actually figure out solutions the adaptation solutions are going to need to manage this.
Thanks, yeah. And I should just, I suppose, clarify the mapping that will be produced as part of the NCCRA is national scale mapping. So it's not 3, it does 8 regions. It's not going to get into the site level, but it is based on very granular mapping. So I think a lot of the Translate stuff is based on a 2-kilometre grid. So you'll have evapotranspiration, precipitation, temperature, all that. That's open data, publicly available. The EPA are in the process of developing water resource projections based on Translate, so they're aligned to those scenarios, and they'll be on a river reach basis, what the future flows are likely to be at the medium flow and the low flows. And that will be open data as well, is my understanding. There are certain GDPR and security issues around water supplies, whether they're taken out, etc. So you then have what we call the augmented flows, the actual influence flows in the rivers. Some of that data may or may not be available for given reasons. In relation to flood risk, there are issues around making that commercially available. I can't speak for the OPW, but you know there's potential property value impacts, accuracy concerns, etc. So I don't think that's commercially available at the moment. Whether or not that changes remains to be seen. And just in terms of the spatial data, the granular data that we're using for individual asset identification at the NCCRA, we're using the OSI Prime 2 data set, which is kind of best level we have at the moment. So I think if there is an appetite, a known appetite through engagement from sectors for given data sets, it may be possible to, in some sort of aggregated sense, make stuff available. In other cases, it might be quite granular. There'll have to be, I suppose, you know, sectoral and privacy considerations taken into account in each case. For example, the land parcel system that the Department of Ag have, that can never be made public for very obvious reasons. But you may be able to have proxy maps or derived maps from that that can be made publicly available. This is a national level assessment. It's not a project level assessment. But there's climate services that will be developed as a result of the sectoral risk assessments. When they receive sufficient feedback, can go into that level of granularity in certain places.
Katie, just one question for you related to something that was mentioned briefly, net gain as a tool to measure. And I think the building construction sector, real estate, have adopted this largely in the UK. There was signs of it coming over here, but if we rode back to that, maybe just give us a quick update on your view as to where that is as a framework for assessing biodiversity.
Yeah, for those who have an impact or own land directly, a direct land impact, should I say, in their own operations, biodiversity net gain ensures that their land or their development is left in a better place than what it was when they got it. So it's legislated in the UK. It's expected to come into legislation here. It is very usable. It's easy to measure. I think purists might argue that the developer is allowed to remove biodiversity and kind of put it back in a way that suits them. So I think the way in which it'll be brought in Ireland fully remains to be seen. It'll be interesting, but we are seeing a lot of our construction companies use it. In particular, say those who might be looking to attribute an LTIP or a target to something that they're not too comfortable with, choosing carbon biodiversity net gain is a good alternative, and we're seeing conversations on that there.
Okay, thank you. Any last question? Yes. Go ahead.
If I just could add something to my answer to everything. I just thought of something else. You mentioned culvert design for future developments and stuff like that. CSRD obviously isn't the only way that adaptation is going to come into play for corporates and everyone else. I think from my perspective, a lot of it is going to come in through design manuals, design standards, etc. So the likes of the future river flow, the future flood data is going to get incorporated into design manuals, into building regs, into spatial planning. That's how that's going to happen. And that'll obviously have a knock-on effect for corporates. And it'll come into regulation. For example, the EPA since May of this year has now required Ishka Errant, when we do license reviews, to put an adaptation plan in place for their infrastructure for the wastewater treatment plants. You can see the likes of that spreading out through time. That will have implications then if you have IPC licenses, if you have adaptation plans, and if you have CSRD reporting. Should they all contradict each other or should they align? That's a separate question. You know.
Okay. Last question, Orla.
it makes people nervous. There's no doubt about it, because it's perceived as a cost straight up. But I suppose the critical thing to remember, and this is what we're trying to communicate all the time, is that this is quite a cold, rational assessment of future. And it's not that adaptation is in any way a novel thing. It's essentially just renamed long-term planning, because when the climate has changed, our long-term planning now has to use the new climate variables, and that's the future we're going to face. There's no option in it. So I suppose if you look at the cost of adaptive measures, be it bigger culverts or bigger attenuation ponds or higher flood walls or whatever the case may be, more green infrastructure, that is, if it's assessed properly and if the co-benefits and the nature-based solutions are properly accounted for and properly valued, and that's a whole separate issue around natural capital accounting, etc., they will actually be cheaper than the alternative when you do that kind of rational assessment. So there's a communication piece in that, but that's our perspective on it.
Very good. Thank you all. We'll bring our meeting to a conclusion. Firstly, just to thank the panel. A difficult, challenging subject from top level right down into the detail and the weeds, if we're allowed. So I'm sure there's no weeds in your mother-in-law's. It sounds like she's clearing out all the weeds. I'd like to thank Deborah and the committee again for their continued support and involvement, and indeed the EPA and SEAI for their support of the network, and AIB for hosting here today, and in particular Grania, who's over there busily sorting out everything for us. So I think the next get together we'll have as a group will be our report launch, which will be sometime either late February, early March, depending on when the scores are released. We are expecting, at least we're being told, because of the new system that we all loved going through this year, that our scores will be out a little earlier this year. So we will expect to see the scores either probably early in the new year. So that's you're looking to have them. I know a number of people have said, well, we have our scores for our annual report. That is the expectation, that they will be out earlier this year. And after the fun and games that we had this year, we are going to be doing a bit of a post-mortem on the good, the bad, and the ugly from last year's disclosure. We had a lot of new questions, and we had a new platform which caused a lot of problems for people. We would like to give feedback, constructive feedback to CDP on that. So we will be reaching out to you with the survey, and the committee will then have a meeting to discuss that and provide feedback. So thanks again. Look forward to seeing you at our next meeting. And we will also be running a series of knowledge shares. I mean, one of the things that I was delighted to hear that some of the risk assessments will be done particularly on a sector basis. Those of us who are grappling with double materiality assessments, and obviously there's a lot of material issues in certain sectors. So we are hoping to try and develop, which we trialed, I guess, this year, some knowledge share groups within particular sectors. So for instance, Shane is here. Shane headed up our finance knowledge share this year. So we will be running a number of knowledge shares during the course of the year. So keep an eye out on the CDP Ireland network, LinkedIn page, and for direct messages from us. So thank you very much. And yeah, round of applause again for